Hi, everyone. Hello from all of us here at ENGworks. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, BIM Content Utilization, a Fireside Chat, a discussion about BIM content and its creation methodologies, uses, and functionalities. My name is Nelida Ramos, and I will be your host for today. Let's start with the housekeeping instructions. We will have a 45-minute discussion following with a 15-minute Q&A. You can submit your questions in the chat to the right of your screen, and at the end, we will go through them. Whichever question we cannot get to, we'll be sure to follow up in our social media and email. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all of you. The speakers for today's webinar are Jim Meseke and Ian McGaw. Jim Meseke is the Vice President of Global Content Services here at ENGworks. For more than a decade, Jim has been working diligently at ENGworks, innovating modeling techniques and advancing the development of quality Revit BIM content. He has guided MEP product manufacturers to focus on providing proper project functionality, thereby enhancing the BIM user experience and ensuring design professionals will continue to specify ENGworks developed BIM content. As a self-proclaimed recovering architect, Jim has offered 25 years of experience throughout various disciplines in the AEC industry. He has devised, documented, and implemented discipline-specific project standards for a number of architectural and engineering companies, including providing on-site training and BIM content solutions for managers and their staff. Ian McGaw is the Vice President of Global Technology and Innovation here at ENGworks. Ian has a dual degree in computer science and international business, focusing on the development of technologies. He is an executive business leader with broad domestic and international experience in identifying strategic and innovative technology solutions to complex business challenges. Ian has experience in the full value chain of project development process, starting from strategic planning, project planning, business innovation strategy, and portfolio management for clients all the way to project turnover. Furthermore, Ian has been invited to speak at numerous conferences, including Autodesk University, upon topics ranging from BIM content to implementation of technology to VDC. And now, I will leave you with Jim and Ian to get this fireside chat started.
All right, great. Thanks, Nelida. And thank you everyone for joining us. This is Ian McGaw. So what our purview for this discussion here today, I'm just gonna start asking Jim a few questions and we'll see where the conversation takes us. So Jim, to start off, I think, a little bit of a level set here. If you could, how do you define content?
That's a great question. Well, I guess on a first and foremost, it's going to be I'll guide that answer towards specifically towards BIM and more specifically towards Revit, at least first. But they're going to be geometric representations, 2D and 3D, of products, manufacturers or otherwise, product assemblies, elements for design professionals for use in their projects. It's essentially, the way I see it is BIM content producing BIM content is providing the tools for design professionals, whether it be architecture, engineering, interior design, what have you, providing those tools for the design professionals to accomplish what they need for their daily deliverables on live projects.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so a virtual representation of a physical product, right? Now, how do you? I know you mentioned the design teams there. Um, how do you see the definition being the same or different for contractors or during construction?
Great question. Well, I guess when I try to think about things, I like to think about the construction process, or at least the life cycle. From conception of the project, starting at the owner, engaging the architect, and that's where the design process is going to be more geared towards. Obviously for the architect, it's going to be what's aesthetically pleasing. It's what's going to be a good representation of the building and design elements. For engineers, it's going to be the accurate representations of the building systems. But then there's a sort of a shift, after the construction documents then are produced and bid, they're going to ultimately lie in the hands of the GCs, who are going to need to they need a whole different set of rules, I guess, because they have to be more geometrically accurate. So the level of detail needs to be higher than it would be in the design phase. But they also need an accurate description of the products to allow them to create their bill of materials, for the for the projects. So it does lend itself to get more complex as you get closer to construction.
Interesting. Okay, so Jim, based off of your response there, I know you've mentioned these different levels of content here. Does that mean that you would have an individual product or virtual product for the design team, and then an individual product for the construction team?
Well, that's going to depend on which platform they're using. For design, people have a tendency to use, I'll speak specifically towards Revit. Why? Because they're going to get what they need out of it. Obviously Revit's a object-oriented platform, so the users are going to be able to basically to get their design elements organized, make sure that they are schedulable, make sure that they're able to get what they need during the design process. And the same is true for engineering. Users are going to, from the engineering perspective, are going to want content that's going to not only look right, but it's also going to be able to pass data from object to object. I mean, that's really the whole point of BIM. It's intelligent. It's creation of intelligent objects which speak to each other.
Okay, interesting. So if let's say a project team is staying within Revit for the design, construction, and further operations of a facility, there are defined levels of detail or LOD, and varying governing bodies. AIA has come out with their 5 levels, and BIM Forum has come out with their several levels as well. So Jim, can you touch on those different levels and perhaps why that might be important if the entire team is in one platform throughout the process?
Well, I think, when it gets to level of detail, it's going to be discipline specific. It's going to be, what you're trying to represent. We do a lot of work in MEP, so there's a lot of representations on the engineering aspect are going to involve single line diagrams and single line representations of piping, fittings, valves, and the assorted of equipment used, whether it be for plumbing or mechanical services. So that, at least from a plan view, that representation is going to be a rather low level of detail. But at the same time, it's selecting those items within your project. You should be able to, they should still be data rich. They should still be identified, what the product is. If it has elements like minimum, maximum temperature, pressure requirements, maximum flow rates, and the like. It's having that information at your fingertips is gonna assist the design professional in making sure that they don't design or don't specify products which aren't going to meet their design requirements. And I guess then to continue along that that same vein, there are certain objects that are going to need to be represented at a much higher level of detail. I can see on the architectural side of things, especially when it comes to set out of furniture and chairs. The architect's going to want content to be sort of a very accurate representation of the objects that they're either designing or they're specifying. And in order to produce those the renderings, or at least be a launch pad for an export to 3D Studio or other rendering platforms. So they're going to want that as well.
Sure.
So I guess it all depends on really who the user is, and what their goal is from the content.
Sure. So Jim, you mentioned some MEP systems there and the fabrication side of things here. When we think about the Autodesk Fabrication Suite here, as a standalone product for a subcontractor, perhaps that has not received an MEP Revit model or just doesn't care to use it, would you recommend, if that subcontractor needs a VAV box, for instance, would you recommend that they translate that VAV box, perhaps if it's created in Revit? Or would you recommend that to create something like that from scratch using the tools available in the fabrication platform?
Yeah, an interesting thing came up not too long ago regarding exactly this. But yeah, to try and fit, there's what you're looking for into an existing CID pattern inside of fabrication. For VAV boxes, they're very critical, and especially when it's going to come to setting up your spools for fabrication. So you want everything to be exact, and that's really kind of the selling point on the fabrication CAD platform is having the stuff. It has to be exact if you're going to deliver it. First of all, you've gone through the coordination process and making sure that everything's clash free when you deliver to the site. Well, if it's then assembled and you find out that a VAV box is really 3 inches longer than what was specified because of the content was inaccurate, well, then you're in a bit of a pickle. I mean, granted, it's sheet metal. It's not it's a change order nonetheless, but it's not the end of the world. But at least it gets a lot more complicated when you've got larger piping systems, flanged pipe, where that stuff, if it's wrong, well, by golly, it's a lot of money to fix.
Yeah. Oh, it absolutely is. That can be hundreds of thousands of dollars to refabricate or tear something out and rebuild it.
Right.
Something you oh, go ahead, Jim, please.
No, I was going to say the issue that came up recently was was regarding exactly the CID patterns, which made me think of this. Is when we build content in Revit, we have the ability to flex the objects according to whatever dimensional data set accompanies that the Revit family, and it's far more flexible for the user than the CID patterns are inside of Revit. And a particular case that arose recently with some of the valve content for a particular manufacturer. Well, the manufacturers had said, well, our CADNet product it doesn't represent, in reality what it looks like, and we have to sort of explain to them. So, well, we have two choices. We can go through the process of utilizing the geometry that comes from Revit and applying the appropriate connectors to the objects, and what that does is going to ensure dimensional accuracy and inside the project. But what it sort of takes away is the ability for a user using a workflow such as the fabrication tools inside of Revit, which is becoming more and more popular as the tools get better and better. But I think it's sort of a limitation of the software right now that the tools haven't caught up to the ability of what was available in fabrication CADNet. So you run into the usability issue. So where you have something that's more or less an exact geometry that we're able to extract from Revit and import into CADNet, well, it's going to lose its functionality if you're using the fabrication tools. So I think that's been a big issue lately. But it's sort of contradictory towards the requirement of a higher level of detail in the fabrication model. So you want the users to have that higher level of detail, yet at the same time you're kind of capped by the constraints within the ID pattern selections. Yeah.
No, that's an interesting challenge there between the two platforms, Jim. One of the questions that came up while you're speaking about these challenges here is, the liability about this. Who owns the content? Not only that, who's responsible for it, right? So, for instance, if a subcontractor utilizes just call it a generic template from fabrication, and it causes a large change order on site, is that the contractor's fault? Yes. Would that be the software developer's fault, right? For maybe not providing the right CID, right? Or template, right? So how do you see, being able to curb from a user's perspective? How are you seeing, whether that's a subcontractor or a designer, how do you see the ability to curb the liability of this content, right? This is a problem I think we've had in the industry for many years, and part of the reason I think why many people didn't want to share their models initially, at least, right, because of the proprietary information, if you will, in them.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, we deal every day with manufacturer-specific content, and and I know that even amongst the manufacturers, there are some that are redesigning their valves and or fittings to shave off a 1/16 of an inch on the metal to save millions of dollars in fabrication, from their perspective, from the manufacturer perspective, and so that sort of like those kind of changes, and they do happen quite frequently with some manufacturers. It's so the ability for those manufacturers to rely on an accurate data set for the dimensions that are representing those objects, that becomes critical. And so whereas you have everyone's seen this, the like a fitting book, or where it lists the lay links of the fittings. But they also have to realize that those pamphlet or catalogs have been put together by marketing groups and not necessarily the engineering department. And I know for several manufacturers, it's been a real source of frustration, because internally, when they're comparing the data sets that for dimensional aspects of the content against what the engineering development team is within that manufacturer is coming up with, well, they're going to find that they're finding out a lot of discrepancies, and ultimately that causes a lot of issues. But back to your question, let me circle it back to the who is liable. It's a very good question. It's ultimately the contractor is going to be liable to make sure that their models meet the dimensions that are specified. I think they would have a hard time coming back and saying, well, hey, I used this version of the content, and if that version of the content was not accurate, or if they worse yet, use their own content or content built by a third party. Actually, that brings up another point. Sometimes we encounter that, whereas we provide support for a lot of manufacturers that we build for, and in some instances we've gotten complaints, which have made the manufacturers really upset. They said, "How can this content be wrong?" They'll come at us rather harshly, and until we go ahead and look at it and say, well, geez, that's not our content at all, because our content would look like this. And then when we show them that, it's like then they're kind of stuck. Well, you can't prevent people from using, I guess for lack of a better term, renegade content. And that ultimately is the responsibility, I think, of the contractor when they're putting the things together.
Okay. Yeah. So to then put that light a little bit back on yourself and your team there, Jim, as we want to make sure that we're providing the highest quality product, right? In terms of a Revit family or a piece of content, right? What can you tell the group here about some of the considerations, perhaps, that you take into account when you're first starting to create a piece of content, right? I know there's certain geometric and perhaps data considerations. What about and what do you do about crossover pieces of content?
Great question. Well, the first stage, I guess I would say, in content development that we refer to internally as investigation. It's really, asking the right questions. What am I creating? It's not just about shape, or it's about what is the function of the piece. What category does it fall under? Is it, or does it require subcategories? And then, again, from the user's perspective, what is important to show graphically, and how do I approach simulating the geometry? It's knowing the answer to some of those questions, and then aside from the geometry itself, it's like what components and or parameters are important or required by an engineer, versus an architect, because there's those. A great sort of cross-platform piece would be lighting. So from an architectural perspective, it's how accurate is it to the actual object? Well, it's got to be pretty darn close. The other aspect is, of course, if it's a light, it's actually a little bit tricky, because it's going to be producing a glow in an architect's rendering. So how much of that do you truly see? Well, I mean, you do see the shape of it, but it's a great piece, because to talk about, because even regarding metadata, the architect's got a lot to consider regarding what are the lumen levels, what's the color rendition, you know, what is that? Because that's going to affect the design. And then from the engineering aspect, it's going to be, you know, well, I guess it was a little bit more of a concern prior to LED, but you know, what is the load? Is it significant? You know, and those different aspects. So there's lots of stuff to consider. Also, you know, how would the family need to be hosted? Is a generic model going to suffice, or is it going to need to be face-based? It's in some aspects, you know, face-based items are a lot easier to control because you can apply them to surfaces. And you know, that also brings up the question of when building the content, you know, what needs to be, what would typically be wall hosted or ceiling hosted. Well, unless you're building specifically architectural content, then it won't. We know, of course, being on the other end, that when you link an architectural model into an engineering model, that if it's a ceiling hosted light fixture, well, you're not going to be able to get anything out of it. You'd have to copy modify the ceiling in order to be able to recreate the light pattern, you know, for your object. So so you could get stuck, and many times we'll see that. Part of my, you know, not day to day, but part of the things I'm tasked to do is to evaluate existing content. And so that's one of the first things that we'll check. You know, if it doesn't have the proper hosting, then it's going to be useless to either the architect or the engineer from the get-go.
Sure.
So those are all, you know, things to consider. And you know, again, back to the level of detail. You know, what kind of representation is required? Got a light fixture that's all it needs to be on a reflected ceiling plan or a lighting plan is going to be, you know, a circle or a collection of circles. A 2D geometric representation will be fine, because if you start to show all the levels of detail, if you just leave all of the geometry on, and it's a light fixture that you've got copied 100 times on a floor, well, that adds to the speed at which the users can navigate the model, you know, and it can bog it down. So there's lots of things to consider.
Absolutely. Yeah, it certainly seems like it. There's quite a list there, Jim. You know, and that kind of begs the question, you know, are there any standards for developing content out there because of the variability and so many different options out there?
Yeah, this is a tough one to put a finger on. There are, you know, there's been obviously, you had mentioned earlier a couple of the AIA, you know, BIM standards and things like that. Part of what I am is aside from what I refer to as a recovering architect, I'm also a recovering AutoCAD user. So that, you know, when I was doing stuff with AutoCAD, you know, I was there when the, you know, the national CAD, so, you know, whatever the national standards came out for AutoCAD, and you get a bunch of people that are going to say, well, these don't apply to me. You know, I'm far superior in my workflows, and so why do I need to change what I do? And there, I wouldn't. Aside from the superiority aspect, I think that there's some truth to that statement. If you can, if it affected somebody in a way that they had to abide by somebody else's ruling when it comes to, you know, imports, exports, you know, it wasn't as tight, and so it wasn't as well adopted. I mean, I still know design professionals on the architectural side who don't use those standards even today. So it's a tricky thing. So then you take that with the complexity of now do I not only do I have to have a you know, geometric representations of design elements, and how do you how do you also conform the data sets that are in there?
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, the starting point was, would have to be the Autodesk content creation guide, which I think was developed at, I think the last issue of it might have been 06 or something like that. I'm not sure exactly when. So it's been a while since they've had that. Prior to the Seek days and such. But those standards, at least, are still followed. Autodesk had a master shared parameter list, and so from a data aspect, the only reason why we'd create new custom shared parameters was the fact that, number one, that they're not on that list, and number two is, quite frankly, is, do they need to be scheduled or used in tags? And if the answer to that is no, then we didn't need to create the shared parameters. So it's also kind of the classification system that's used inside of Revit for these things. It's not fixed. You can customize it, and that's
Jim. What do you mean by classification system? Why would someone want to use a classification system for a piece of content?
Well, to be sure that it shows up on the proper, it shows up proper in the model. For example, I would expect a piece of electrical equipment to be classified as to be categorized as electrical equipment, a switchgear, or trying to think. We had a situation where there was a manufacturer of direct drives who had their entire library model as generic models.
Sure.
And also they weren't face-based, and so they were, and you couldn't rotate them in a project. So imagine that frustration.
Oh, absolutely.
So that entire content library paid for by the manufacturer is then all of a sudden useless.
Right. So as we're talking about classifications and whether that's omni-class or master format classifications, Jim, do you take any considerations into how those different codes or classifications can be leveraged in different third-party applications, perhaps for specification creation or data management?
Well, that's a great question. I'd have to let me think about that for a second.
That's okay. We can come back to that one.
Yeah, it's very complicated. When it's hard enough to keep things straight within the Revit platform itself. But outside Absolutely. Of I guess it's going to come down to the quality of data and how well it exports. It's something I think that you had mentioned to me a couple of years back was, when it comes to considerations for other standards, COBE or something. Let's take COBE for example. There was a couple programs, third-party programs that you can use for it, and the set of shared parameters that you need to have inside your model is going to depend on which program you're using. So it gets difficult to control.
Right. Okay. And you've done a good job, I think, of documenting out our standard and kind of combining various standards, shared parameters over the years, and you leverage those. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. And just to loop back really quick, if anyone's not familiar with COBE, it stands for the Construction Operations Building Information Exchange, and it's leveraged to transform and aggregate data from the design into the construction phase, and then ultimately hand that over to the owner. So with that said, Jim, how do you think, what are some of your best strategies, being as you've been dealing with content for so long, what are some of your best strategies to manage content from an end user perspective?
Yeah, that's another great question. Well, and some of it's going to come from the experience I've had in trying to assist design professionals in specifically that. Everyone so badly wants to not only take ownership but to tweak and modify their content. But I think ultimately, there are some great platforms that they can use to manage content.
Okay.
The two that come to mind right off the bat are Unify and Avail. Both great because they have apps that manage content from within the Revit platform. So if if you think about it, I guess from an office, any design professional is going to want to maintain consistency amongst their building models and their what they're outputting. And so the way they do that is to control what objects can be used and which ones can't.
Sure.
So a lot of times it usually falls on the responsibility for the BIM manager to on the organization. And the great thing about those platforms is you can do exactly that. You can use manufactured content. You can add what you need to add. You can control the content and then make it available to your teams for either design or production aspects. So
interesting. So it sounds like those platforms, Avail and Unify, they provide a lot more functionality for wide area teams than if you just hosted your content on your server, for instance, or on Dropbox.
Yeah, I think so. It's because it's easy to share. You just give someone access to, or if provided you have a license for it, you grant them access to that to that content. So if it's a nationwide firm, for example, that's they want to maintain standards amongst all of their offices, well, it's a great way to do that, as opposed to just loading it on the server and or a cloud-based repository.
Absolutely.
Content.
Yeah. And so when you think about these portals, or excuse me, these platforms, right? You mentioned that they live inside of Revit, I know that Unify has a wonderful back end as well that allows people to understand the metrics of what's in the project, and I believe Avail does too. But Jim, my question here is, what about different portals that are available that perhaps don't have a Revit add-in? How would someone use those? And are those valuable as well?
Yeah, some portals do actually have apps for plugins for Revit, and the sort of the problem I have necessarily with going to portals. I mean, there's two aspects of it, right? One of them is we do a lot of work for manufacturers, so there's reasons why we tend to not steer content towards portals. Because if you're building specifically for a manufacturer, you want to make the manufacturers of content first and foremost should be available on their website and easy to find. But the minute you go to I've seen this a couple times. You'll see, oh, we want our content here. Follow this link, and it sends you to one of those portals, and then you're automatically linked with similar objects that are on those sites that are not built by that manufacturer. So it puts your content, side by side with your competition. And maybe that's for the user. I think maybe that's good because they have the selection. They can make a selection or an alternative right away.
Sure.
A couple different products come to mind, but I won't mention them now. But there's that aspect of it. But the portals themselves, I guess let me give you this example. We have if you're working inside a Revit project and you're specifying a pump, let's say,
Mhm.
and and you've got that particular pump loaded, and then after you're an engineer and after you've done you're doing your design, you realize that the requirements of that are going to change. You either need a stronger pump or one that's not
Mhm.
as robust. So
Right.
either way, you got to go back to the well to get that next piece of content. So what's easier, if you're using one of the platforms like Avail or Unify, you can go right to that piece of content and just load another type. If you
Right.
have otherwise, you have to go back to the well, and when
Mhm.
I the well, I mean back to the portal, download the piece of content, extract it, load the type catalog, and it takes 6 or 7 steps versus having
Sure.
that stuff right at your fingertips.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. But then you kind of run into the problem where, is that content updated if it's housed inside of your platform or your company's library? Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. But I do know that some of the manufacturers that we build for example, part of the um, sort of the service that some of our business partners provide and we provide is maintaining the accuracy of that content, so
Hmm.
that when changes do happen to content, we upload on from the manufacturer's uh, uh, site to make
Sure.
sure that that content is accurate. I guess
Right.
ultimately, can it be accurate 100% of the time?
Hmm.
Maybe not. But at least you're going to be much closer with a single source of truth guiding a single source of data, a single source of truth,
Sure.
guiding the dimensions and metadata that accompany the content.
Hmm. Okay. All right. Okay, Jim. And just a quick time check here, but if you take out your crystal ball, where do you see the content sector going in the next 5 or 10 years? So how do you see it evolving?
Great question. Um, I'm going to say, well, technology is the driver of that. Actually, during this COVID sequestration, I can't say I've watched a lot of TV but I have watched a handful of movies and even some ones that are a little bit older. And you
Hmm.
see people with flip phones or that type of any type of antiquated people going to a payphone to make a phone call, stuff that just you don't see anymore. So, but with that in mind, I guess if I'm looking in my crystal ball, I'm wondering, well, what is the content itself? It needs to be adaptable. It needs
Hmm.
to be able to evolve as technology evolves. Um, right now, I can't say that, as again, I started off, or I mentioned earlier that I was a recovering AutoCAD user. When I first got into AutoCAD, I thought it was the greatest thing. It's I didn't
Sure.
have to I didn't have to use the pin bar anymore, or
Hmm.
the T square, or actually, or the, um, those kind of drafting tools. So again, coming from that perspective, you, the technology is gonna drive it, but I can't guarantee that there's not going to be platform changes. What if there's a newer BIM technology that comes out there,
Hmm.
that Autodesk will buy, but if it does appear, will it
Hmm.
be the next step? This sort of the, you know, parts of the frustrations of the current platforms
Hmm.
may be resolved, and moving towards the future, it's data is going to be the key, um, and
Absolutely.
the data needs to be adaptable. So again, if you're using a single source of truth for your data, your metadata, your dimensional data, I think the evolution might be simple, because it's just going to be a matter of how it's going to be defined,
Hmm.
from one platform
Yeah.
to the next. We're already seeing,
Absolutely.
some of the stuff that you're using, from Revit projects being used in and again, that's other third-party platforms for facilities management. You know, you're seeing that right now, and the technology may not outlive the warranty on some of the products that are being used for the building.
Sure.
So,
sure, which is quite likely. Yeah. And you know, one of the things that I was thinking about in this sense, Jim, was, you know, a few years ago, virtual reality came storming on the scene, and many people adopted it very quickly, and then it kind of fell flat, right? It's kind of difficult to migrate our BIMs into these different virtual reality platforms or even augmented reality platforms, right? And as I think forward, you know, I don't think that those technologies are going to stay by the wayside. I actually think that, you know, in perhaps short order, we'll have augmented reality design tools that leverage this data and content that allow architects, engineers, contractors, even owners to do layouts just kind of as an overlay, almost a virtual trace paper over their real space, you know, and I think that'll be an interesting pivot as to how this content is leveraged, right, and distributed.
Yes, agree. I think that would be the next logical step. You know, it's but again, it's like you touched on it right off the beginning. It's if you're looking at your crystal ball, you know, how far into the future are you seeing? And I believe that technology is, I mean, it's obviously there's some things out there right now. I mean, look at the difference between what surveys used to be. You know, surveys used to be a guy with a pad, a pencil, and a tape measure and a laser. You know, they go out now. Forget that. They're going out there with their iPads, and they're moving it around in a 3D space, generating a point cloud and a 3D model of the space. So it's anticipating those kind of aspects, and it's really also about solving problems. You might have design conditions of an existing site that it's going to require something to be I guess what's the word I'm looking for? To be identified and then solved using augmented reality or
absolutely
VR.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
Sure.
Okay. So Jim, I've got two more questions for you here, kind of lightning round questions, and then we'll open up the forum to the group that's with us. So the first question here, don't put too much thought into this, but what was the last thing that you Googled?
The last thing that I Googled was looking for manufacturer-specific content.
Okay. All right. Good answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then a little off topic here, but who's your favorite character, Rick or Morty?
Rick. Rick. Yeah, definitely Rick. Yeah.
All right.
Combination of genius and alcoholic. How can you go wrong? So
there you go.
Great question.
Yeah, wonderful. All right, Jim. Well, I think we've had a really nice conversation here. What I'd like to do is open up the floor to questions, if anyone has those. And Alita, perhaps if you could either curate those or unmute the folks, whichever you'd like.
Yeah. So right now we haven't received any questions. So if anyone has one, go ahead and write it there in the chat. But also, if you don't have any questions now, but you have any other of them later, you can contact Ian or Jim. There we have their emails. I'm pretty sure they will be happy to answer your questions. So let's see. I haven't seen nothing here yet, but meanwhile, let's see if someone gives a question. Please follow us in our social media platforms, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, so that you can be updated with our announcements and our next webinar. We will be doing a series of webinars like the one today, some demos. So we are really excited to share all that with all of you. So I haven't seen any questions in here. I'm gonna unmute everyone in case someone wants to just go ahead and say it out loud. If you want to unmute yourself, just go ahead and unmute yourself. Okay.
Well, no worries. Well,
okay.
If there are any questions, we thank you all very much for joining us today. We appreciate you all taking the time.
Yes, and thank you, Ian and Jim, for sharing your knowledge. Thank you, everyone.
A pleasure.